Welcome. Let me take you on a journey into a story that holds within it a secret so profound, it has the power to change everything we think we know. This isn't a rumor or a wild story spun by the media. It's a real confession, one whispered in the quietest of moments, filled with such emotion that it felt almost impossible to bear. Pope Francis, in his final days, shared words that shook even those who had never truly believed. He spoke with such raw vulnerability that it made even the most skeptical hearts tremble. Picture this. The room was heavy with silence, so thick that the air seemed to quiver. Pope Francis, surrounded by this profound stillness, struggled to keep his eyes open, tired beyond measure, but still carrying the weight of a life spent in faith. His words, faint but filled with immense gravity, carried a truth so deep that even those who didn't share his faith could not ignore it. And as he whispered, you could almost hear the faint creak of the crucifix in his trembling hands, the one thing that still anchored him in the midst of the pain he was revealing. What had he discovered in those last years? What had he learned from the ancient texts, from the prayers long forgotten, from the whispers of the Spirit? This is where the door to a secret, hidden for centuries, is finally being opened. It's a door that many powerful forces have tried to keep shut for as long as history has been written. Behind this door lies a truth about Jesus that has the potential to change everything we understand about him. Are you truly ready to hear it? But before we dive into that, take a moment. If you love Jesus and feel grateful for the wisdom Pope Francis shared throughout his life, show your respect. Comment, "Thank you, Holy Father," as a way to honor his legacy of love and humility. Even though he now rests in the arms of God, his teachings continue to echo in the hearts of those who dare to listen. Share this message to carry his legacy further, and if you haven't already, subscribe to keep walking this journey together. Let's remember as we go forward that Jesus still speaks through those like Pope Francis, who loved unconditionally until the very end. Now let's go back to where this all began. It was in a simple room in the Vatican, far from the grandeur you might expect. There were no cameras, no prepared speeches, just an intimate moment between Pope Francis and a young priest, someone he trusted deeply. This conversation was never meant to be shared with the world, but the priest, after much hesitation, felt compelled to speak out. He asked the Pope a question. "Holy Father, do you believe that Jesus had human fears?" The question hung in the air, full of uncertainty, yet it carried a weight that could not be ignored. Pope Francis, his gaze fixed on a well-worn crucifix, responded in a voice filled with a depth that couldn't be faked. His words were not just an intellectual response. They were born from a place of deep spiritual understanding. What if the pain Jesus endured was far more than just physical? What if his spiritual agony was far deeper than we've ever dared to consider? A pain so profound that it still echoes today, though silent, in the souls of those who listen. That night, Pope Francis couldn't sleep. He held in his hands a Bible that had been with him through decades of prayer and searching. The pages were frayed, underlined, and stained with the marks of a lifetime devoted to seeking truth. And among these well-worn pages, one passage haunted him, refusing to let go. And he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Matthew 26:37. These were not just ancient words. They were a living, breathing testament to the agony of Jesus. Pope Francis closed his eyes, feeling the weight of it all, as if he were there in the Garden of Gethsemane with Jesus, alone in his suffering. But it wasn't just the physical absence of his disciples that made Jesus feel alone. It was the weight of the world's sins, the unspoken guilt, the invisible wounds of humanity that he carried. At that moment, Pope Francis whispered, "I saw his tears," but they didn't fall to the ground. Instead, the angels gathered them, trembling in sorrow. These were not just tears. They were the cries of a broken world, felt in the deepest corners of heaven itself. The confidant could barely breathe upon hearing this, as if each word stuck in his soul. Francis continued, almost in a broken whisper, "God showed me that each tear of Jesus had a name, and one of them was mine." What did that mean? That our stories, our faults, our wounds are inscribed in his sacred tears. And if what Francis revealed is true, that Jesus not only died for us but also with us, feeling each of our losses and anguish, then everything changes. In the following days, moved by an internal urgency that not even he could fully understand, Francis asked for access to ancient handwritten Vatican texts, forgotten for centuries, buried in dusty basements, shrouded in the silence of fear and oblivion. Gospels never included in the official canon, letters from martyrs of the first centuries, prophetic visions sealed by fear, or by a prudence dictated by fear. And there, in the midst of that silent and desperate search, he found something that would forever change the way he looked at Jesus. A fragment attributed to an anonymous disciple said, "The Master told us that centuries would come when the image of the Son would be distorted, that they would crown him as king but forget his crying." That phrase shook him like a silent and devastating earthquake. It was not heresy. It was a clear, painful, and urgent warning. Jesus did not come to be worshipped as an emperor on an unattainable throne of gold. He came to be understood as a man, broken with love for each of us, not as a distant God, but as a deeply wounded brother who embraced humanity until his last breaths. The Pope shared this reflection in a low voice, almost like a sigh with his closest confidant. "We have made Jesus an immobile statue, but he continues to walk among us with dirty feet and a heart completely open, ready to break again and again for love." It was not a scandal. It was not a provocation. It was a desperate plea, a sincere cry to look again at Jesus, not as an untouchable symbol, but as the Savior who cried for each one of us, who cried with each one of us, feeling in his flesh our own wounds. One night, while praying in solitude in the small chapel of Santa Marta, Francis suddenly fell to his knees. Not from illness or physical weakness, but due to an invisible weight, an inescapable spiritual burden that overwhelmed him from the depths of his soul. "Lord, show me what I still do not understand," he whispered in a barely audible voice. And then, something happened. Something that, to this day, is only recorded in the private diaries of the Vatican, in pages sealed not with ink but with silent tears. A warm but disconcerting dim light enveloped the place, but it was not a classic apparition like those described in devotional books. It was a living presence, an unquestionable certainty that could not be explained or described with the limitations of human words. The Pope saw Jesus, but not as a triumphant and glorious king. He saw him as an exhausted man, bleeding, completely destroyed, yet with infinite tenderness in his eyes, a tenderness that crossed the soul like a silent and eternal lightning bolt. And then he heard a phrase, not in his ears but directly in his heart, like an indelible impression. "I did not come to be understood. I came to be accompanied." Francis burst into tears, there, alone. The man who represented the entire world before God was reduced to a spiritual child in the face of such a heartbreaking revelation. He finally understood, with painful clarity burning in every fiber of his being, that his role was not simply to defend a structured religion, but to reflect a broken, wounded heart that, despite everything, continues to love without measure or condition. Days later, driven by a need impossible to ignore, Francis secretly summoned two cardinals of absolute trust. In the privacy of his most sacred rooms, he shared with a trembling voice and profound emotion what had been revealed to him. More deeply, one of them, pale and visibly disturbed, asked, Holiness, does this mean that Jesus still suffers? And the Pope, with immense seriousness and an ancient weight in his eyes, responded without hesitation. Jesus is not dead in the past. He lives in every current suffering. He walks silently with every mother who loses her child, with every young person who cannot find purpose, with every soul that cries out in silence and hears no reply. It was a vision of Jesus that did not deny doctrine. It did not contradict the church, but it transcended it, showing the Redeemer not only as the glorious conqueror of death, but as the silent and suffering companion of every affliction, of every small death that a human endures. Francis did not seek to change the faith. He was not a revolutionary in search of turmoil. He sought to restore the living relationship, return us to the human Jesus who looks into your eyes with infinite tenderness, who stays when all others have abandoned you. And that, without a doubt, was his greatest secret, his greatest spiritual gift, one that did not fit into a homily nor a public sermon, but into an intimate whisper between hearts willing to listen. The cardinals left that meeting with pale faces, like those who have seen something they can never forget or erase. One of them, trembling as he wrote, left a testimony on paper. The Pope spoke to us as someone who no longer feared death, but rather the silence that follows an untold truth, a truth too alive to be buried in oblivion that night. Francis could not sleep. He stayed awake, slowly reviewing each moment of his pontificate, every decision made with pain or hope, each mistake, each prayer thrown to heaven like a muffled cry. In his heart, a new certainty arose, one he had known for years. He had faithfully served the institutional church, but now, with every remaining fiber of his being, he had to serve the living Jesus, the Jesus who dwells in the flesh and in the cry of the forgotten. He then ordered a private letter to be written, not a solemn encyclical nor a message prepared for the multitudes, but a personal confession, an intimate testament, a spiritual legacy meant to be opened only after his physical death. In that letter, written with a firm but painted hand, he expressed, Jesus did not come for us to worship him with awe. He came for us to follow him with true and committed love. We have worn his cross of shining gold, and we have forgotten the real pain he endured in his vulnerable and exposed flesh. Every word of that letter was an open wound, a silent plea launched toward hearts willing to hear a cry, so that faith would not become an empty ritual, but a burning rebirth, alive and pulsating. Not everyone in the Vatican immediately embraced the Pope's words. For some, they felt unsettling, even threatening. In the golden corridors, away from the public eye, whispers spread, questioning the wisdom of what was said. He is undermining the powerful image of the Messiah, they muttered. But Pope Francis, deeply attuned to what he had seen and felt in his heart, could not be swayed. His understanding was undeniable, a truth that could not be ignored or silenced. In a small, intimate mass, without cameras or rehearsed speeches, he shared a profound thought that struck even the hardest of hearts. What if Jesus returned today and we didn't recognize him? He asked. What if we were still waiting for the glorious King in majesty, but missed the suffering brother walking beside us in the shadows? The chapel was consumed by an overwhelming silence, so still that it felt as though time itself had paused to reflect. Some of those present wept quietly, others trembled, not fully grasping the weight of the words, but all felt something stir within them, a truth they didn't yet know how to define, but could no longer ignore. A shift had occurred in the air, palpable to those who could sense it. The Pope, no longer preaching from a pedestal of authority, was now speaking from a place of deep love, vulnerability, and humanity. He was no longer the distant figure representing an unyielding institution. Instead, he had become a witness to the fragility of life, a voice of compassion grounded in shared experience. In that moment, he planted a seed, one that would only grow after he was gone, in the hearts of those open to listening beyond doctrine and dogma. Shortly before his health took a sharp decline, Pope Francis had a brief but profound encounter with a young boy suffering from leukemia. The meeting was meant to follow the rigid schedule of the Vatican's official calendar, but it lasted far longer than anyone had anticipated. Over an hour passed in deep, wordless connection. The boy, with the innocent boldness that only children possess, asked, "Does Jesus' heart hurt like mine?" The Pope, his eyes brimming with tears that he could no longer hide, responded softly, "Your heart and his beat together when you cry." That encounter left an indelible mark on Francis. From then on, his homilies slowed down. They became rich with emotion, punctuated by silences that often spoke louder than any words. No longer did he seek applause or recognition. He was no longer concerned with public approval, but with reaching the core of people's souls, awakening them to something deeper. It was then that he began to withdraw, not out of resignation, but out of a quiet acceptance of the inevitable, preparing for the final journey he knew was approaching. In the final stage of his reflections, the Pope penned a letter revealing a vision that had come to him in a dream. In this dream, he saw the crucifixion unfold, not as it had been described in Scripture, but as a contemporary event set in the middle of modern indifference. "I saw Jesus crucified in the heart of the city," he wrote, surrounded by the noise of a world that was too busy, too immersed in its own distractions to notice him. People walked by, engrossed in their phones, oblivious to the sacred suffering happening right before them. And then, in a moment of startling clarity, the Pope wrote something that left many stunned. "Jesus looked at me from the cross and said, 'They didn't forget me out of ignorance. They replaced me with entertainment.'" Those words hung heavily in the room, and the silence that followed was almost unbearable. Was it a dream, a divine message, or something more profound? The Pope's words continued, inviting a crucial question. If Jesus were with us today, would we be able to recognize him? Or have we forgotten how to see him in the faces around us, in the struggles we no longer notice? He also shared a secret prayer, one that he recited every morning in solitude, away from the public eye. It wasn't a prayer approved by any official liturgy. It was his personal, intimate conversation with the Jesus he had encountered in his dreams. "Lord, if you returned today in flesh and blood, would you be recognized, or would you be crucified once more?" As his health deteriorated, Pope Francis became more than just a leader of the Church. He became one with the people he served, embodying the love and suffering of Christ. His final message, written in trembling handwriting, was clear. "Do not remember me as the Pope. Remember me as the man who spoke to me through tears." What he had come to understand, deeply and unequivocally, was that Jesus is much closer to us than we realize. In the midst of the noise of modern life, he no longer calls out in thunderous voices or grand displays. Instead, he speaks in whispers, in quiet murmurs that stir the soul if we choose to listen. Listen to him, the Pope urged, before the world's distractions make us deaf to his voice forever. Since then, theologians, clergy, and the faithful have debated the meaning of his final revelations. Some have viewed them as a deeply personal legacy, one that doesn't seek controversy or scandal, but rather calls for an inner transformation. Whether these were divine revelations or simply the reflections of an aging man nearing the end of his life remains a mystery. But for those who truly knew him, who looked beyond the robes and the formalities, it was clear. This was the moment when Pope Francis stopped being just a figurehead. He became something far more profound, a mirror to the human soul, a raw reflection of our deepest wounds and our highest hopes. The message he left behind wasn't about apocalyptic prophecies or catastrophic predictions. It was about the urgent need to reconnect with our lost sense of compassion, to rediscover the principle of the heart. Jesus spoke to Francis, and in that moment he may be speaking to you as well. Are you hearing him? Look closely, and you will find him in the darkest corners of your life, in the cries of pain and suffering that go unnoticed by the world. Jesus is not far away. He never has been. He isn't waiting for you in golden thrones or grand cathedrals. He is present in the forgotten spaces, in the quiet suffering of hospital rooms, in the silent pain of the lonely and desperate. Maybe what Pope Francis revealed wasn't a secret for a select few, but a truth waiting for all of us to embrace. Jesus is near, if we're willing to open our hearts and truly listen. Today, more than ever, the Pope's words continue to resonate. His message is simple but profound. Do not worship my image, accompany my cross. This is the heart of his legacy, a call to live with compassion, to truly be present in the world as Jesus was. Christianity is not about empty rituals or cold statues. It's about living with love, suffering with the broken, and sharing in the pain of the world.